My name is Sue Murphy, and I proudly serve as the Executive Director of the Robert H. Jackson Center. I took the reins of this extraordinary organization in December of 2015, and it is my great pleasure to add my welcome and thanks to all of you for being with us to celebrate the Jackson Center's 15th anniversary and to commemorate the 70th anniversary of the conclusion of the Nuremberg Trial, looking back at Jackson's life and the Jackson Center's history, and looking forward into the future at opportunities and possibilities. This year, 2016, marks the Jackson Center's 15th year of promoting liberty under law through the examination of the life and work of U.S. Supreme Court Justice Robert H. Jackson and its relevance to current events and issues. The work we do is quite varied. We develop and present exhibits and educational programs for the entire spectrum of ages. We facilitate research, we provide college internship experiences, and much, much more. Through our initiatives, collaborations, and strategic alliances, we touch literally tens of thousands of lives each year, locally, regionally, nationally, and internationally. Overall, we are educators, expanding awareness, and informing the dialogues taking place in classrooms, at community and corporate leadership tables, and within institutions of higher learning and public policy in our region, across the nation, and around the world. This evening's printed program features a representation of the Jackson Center's effort and reach by the numbers, showcasing just a part of the impact the Jackson Center has had over the past 15 years. Examples are 10,000 books given to school children, 20,000 visitors each year, and rising, and 5 million views on YouTube, among many other significant achievements. Of course, you know that this impact was and is only achievable through philanthropic support, and we ask that you make the Jackson Center one of your giving priorities in order to make sure our work and impact continues into the future. If you haven't made your annual fund gift yet, don't worry, there is still plenty of time to do so, or to increase your gift should you be so inspired by tonight's program. Now, in addition to philanthropy, this impact would not be possible without what I have taken to calling our small but mighty staff, our many volunteers, and our co-founders, Carl Kappa, in whose namesake theater we are now gathered, Betty Lene, a veritable legend in Chautauqua and someone I was fortunate enough to know and work in service with, and the one and only Greg Peterson. When people ask me, so how's it going working with Greg? My answer is, you know, when Greg gets that twinkle in his eye, you buckle up your seatbelt and get ready for the roller coaster ride. Greg recounts that he was inspired at the original 1996 dedication of the Jackson statue, and he began then to dream of a Robert H. Jackson Center. He got that twinkle in his eye. Well, I was not here for the first 15 years ride, but just look where it has brought us. And more importantly, look where we're poised to go. Thanks to Greg and to his co-founders, Betty and Carl, two of the first people captured by that twinkle, and all of the people who jumped on the roller coaster ride with Greg and brought us to where we are today. And now I am very pleased to invite to the podium Dexter Benedict, the sculptor who created our freshly rededicated statue and the newest addition to our Jackson Center collections about to be revealed. And along with Dexter, please help me welcome Donald and Christine Wertman, the Jackson Center benefactors who made this addition possible, to add their comments as well. As you can see from the photo collage on the screen, our development director, Marion Beckrink, and I spent a delightful afternoon with Dexter and Don and Christine in Penn Yan, New York, the week before last, and toured Dexter's studio and foundry. Then we loaded Bob, as he liked to be called, and his pedestal into the back of my Suburban for the trip back to Jamestown to await his unveiling. And we are also very pleased, after the remarks that Dexter and Don and Christine might like to make, we would like to invite two of Robert H. Jackson's grandchildren who are with us here this evening. They were introduced earlier. Current board member Julia Craighill and former board member Tom Loftus will come up and join Doug Neckers here on the stage to join in the unveiling. So, Dexter?
Well, thank you very much. It has been a pleasure in my work to give personages to heroes, and certainly Robert Jackson stands out amongst the many pieces that I have done as one of the most heroic and commendable people. It's been exciting, and I feel honored and privileged to have had that opportunity. And I'm pleased to be here this evening with Chris and Don Wertman. As I've said jokingly, not so jokingly actually, to some, Michelangelo had Pope Julius as his benefactor, and I have Chris and Don Wertman, who have oftentimes come up with ideas and have stepped forward to fund various sculpture projects, and so I'm very grateful to them. Also, I want to say about the movement of, I should say, of the Jackson sculpture from the Love School over here. Greg called some time ago and said they were thinking about possibly moving, if they could, move the sculpture to the Jackson Center, because it was in a situation where it wasn't really being cared for. It was a nice site, but not really being properly cared for at the Love School. And so we didn't want to wax it at that point because it would make it look good. So we let it be, and Greg and company were able to engineer the move to the Jackson Center, and I think most of you, and certainly I do, feel like it's finally arrived home. It looks great out front. And so, again, thank you to all that were involved in that, and much appreciated. Okay, I'm going to turn this over to Don. Thank you.
Good evening. The only direct relationship I have to Justice Jackson is that he was a Freemason and a Scottish Rite Mason, as am I, Freemason. And so that's the only direct relationship that I have with him. And so my comments center on the thought, how do you come to know Justice Robert H. Jackson? Well, for me and for Chris, it was a public showing of the portrait bust that Professor Benedict created for the Supreme Court. They invited friends, neighbors, persons of interest, if you will, to come to the studio and see this creation, which was going to be received by the current Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, John Roberts. And so we went and we saw it, and we were quite impressed with it. And then subsequently, that same year, we went to Chautauqua, as we do every year, and I said to Chris, let's go and visit the Jackson Center. And so we came here, and Tom Schmidt took us on a tour and gave us the story, and that was wonderful. And of course, having seen that wonderful portrait bust that was going to the Supreme Court, I asked Tom, do you have a bronze bust of Justice Jackson? No, we don't. Oh, well, too bad. Then we went back to Chautauqua, and outside our room, talk about circumstantial, outside our room was a bookcase. And I was looking for a book to read, as one does in between all the programming at Chautauqua. One keeps the mind active. There was a biography of Robert H. Jackson. So I picked it up, and I read it. And what I came to learn was that of course, it was President Harry S. Truman who appointed Justice Jackson to serve as the chief prosecutor at Nuremberg. Now, it just happened that Chris and I have a rather long knowledge and somewhat of a relationship with the Truman Library in Independence, Missouri. And I called, when we got back home, I called the director of the library, who was actually the interim at the time, and I said, I know that you have a display right now about World War II. Do you have anything on Nuremberg? Yes, we do. Do you have anything on Justice Jackson? Yes, we have, a story about him and what have you. And I said, how would you feel about having a portrait bust of Justice Jackson as part of your permanent collection, since it was President Truman who appointed him and who, parenthetically, also insisted that Justice Jackson not resign from the Supreme Court, as some of his court colleagues were urging him to do. Well, it didn't take them long to get back to me, and I called Professor Benedict in the meantime, and I said, if they elect to agree to accepting a portrait bust of Jackson, would you create it? Well, there was no question he would create it. And they got back in short order and said we'd be delighted to have it. So a year ago, just now a year ago, Dexter and I, Greg Peterson and Tom Schmidt accompanied that portrait bust to Independence, Missouri, presented it to the Truman Library. Julia Craighead was there, so glad she was able to be present. And we a number of my colleagues from my industry were able to join us, and of course the staff and those who were visiting the library that day. And they created a room just for the Nuremberg trials and just for Justice Jackson. So that was a wonderful, wonderful occasion. And then I kept thinking about the fact that Tom Schmidt said, no, we don't have a portrait bust of the justice. And at that time, it was only a dream that perhaps the standing statue could be moved here. So it wasn't at all certain. So again, I asked Dexter, would you create yet another portrait bust of the justice that we could present to the Jackson Center? And as was alluded to earlier, the rationale behind this business of creating bronze portrait busts is that they're enduring. They last virtually forever. You know, you need 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit to melt bronze. Now, yes, you can bang it up a bit and you can do whatever you wish, I suppose, if you really are intent on it. But at the end of the day, they're virtually indestructible. And as I've learned more and more about Justice Jackson and his work and his impact, and we learned more again this evening about him and his work, it's clear to me that his work is enduring and is of great importance in the not only in the legal world, but to all of humanity. And one could only hope that more of our students and more of our citizenry could be aware of him and of his dedication. And so calling the Jackson Center and saying, we're ready to do a portrait bust of Justice Jackson, would you accept it? Well, they knew Professor Benedict's work, and they said, yes, we'd be delighted to have it. And so I was fortunate to be able to work with Professor Benedict when the bronze was poured, and to see the work as it evolved and took place. And as you can see, or at least you could see earlier, actually Susan and Mary Ann came out before transporting the piece here to see how it was done. And you understand that, and there is Dexter showing the area where the bronze is actually melted in that cauldron, in that recessed cauldron there. And when you understand that this is a 5,000-year process that has virtually not changed during that time, you come to have such a great appreciation for what it is that he does. And so that's how I came to know Justice Jackson. And I continue to be, I just saw it downstairs a moment ago. Justice Antonin Scalia signed a book, which is downstairs along with the other justices of the Supreme Court, who said, "I hold the seat formerly held by Justice Jackson. I'm proud to do so, and I consider him one of the most important and prominent members of the Supreme Court in modern times."
Thank you so much.
I'm Doug Neckers. I'm chairman of the board of the Jackson Center, and I want to thank you again for all of your coming here this evening to help us celebrate this occasion. Many of us were just in Nuremberg for the 70th anniversary of the judgment at Nuremberg, and the entire ambiance of that tremendous event in human history collapsed back on us as Loretta Lynch gave the keynote address in the courtroom 600 at the Palace of Justice just about 2 weeks ago. John is a very good friend of the Jackson Center. He's a very good friend of mine. He's a very good friend of Greg's. He's a very good friend of the whole audience. He's a Chautauquan. He's a Western New Yorker, and he's a New Yorker. John, I've heard some marvelous lectures from you in here before, and I'm counting on this tonight about Nuremberg to bring the events of the evening to its apex. John.
Thank you so much, Doug, and all friends here. I always love when Doug thinks back to his youth and tells me about the Wright brothers, but I also, more truthfully, have so many wonderful memories associated with this room and this place and this center and these wonderful people. I want to especially thank Father Fuchs, who's my direct connection to Justice Jackson at Nuremberg, and it's a real honor always to be with him and to have him here tonight. Tom Loftus, Jackson's oldest grandchild, was born during the Nuremberg Trial and remembers his grandpa, and his presence also honors me. Julia Craighill came too late in the game to know her grandfather directly, but through her I know her mother, who was Jackson's beloved daughter, and so those tangible links are extremely important. As each of you is, because of what you've built here in this Jackson Center. And it has been a building process. I want to just take you a bit down memory lane and juxtapose two things on this night of the statue being rededicated. One is the statue. I met it driving down into Jamestown when I first came out here in 2001 in the springtime as the Jackson Center was getting started. And I guess I had heard from Greg that there was such a thing, and I pulled over and I looked at it, and, you know, Dexter, I was most impressed. It was a beautiful sculpture in a a sturdy monument to this great life that I was beginning to work on. And I was in the audience for a program here on that first occasion. I was part of a program here later that fall. I was back here for a program the next fall of 2002, where we brought together 3 of Justice Jackson's earlier law clerks for a panel discussion that I moderated. And during the middle of that discussion, with cables and cameras and all kinds of frou-frou in this room, the power blew. The sparks arced out of the ceiling. The kind of smoke of maybe we're burning the place down filled the air. It was a little harrowing, and then there was a 60-minute scrambling around, and somebody got a big extension cord and somehow made power resume, and we resumed the program. And then, you know, after the farewells and so forth, I left town, and I went back north out of Jamestown, and there was a statue again. And I distinctly remember thinking, statue? Solid, perfect, state-of-the-art. Jackson Center? Work remains to be done. And now tonight, kind of officially celebrating the statue coming to the center, marks for me that the center is up to the standard of the statue. So it all kind of comes together quite beautifully. Now I'm here to talk about Nuremberg at 70 and looking forward. And I want to do that in 4 parts. I'm going to talk first about Jackson's going to Germany, and then about Jackson's getting back to Germany, a bit about the Nuremberg Trial itself, and then its legacies. When I say Jackson's going to Germany, I'm not talking about 1945. Instead, I'm 10 years before that. I want to talk about 1935. In that year, Robert Jackson was in his first appointive office in the federal government. He'd been appointed by Franklin Roosevelt and confirmed by the Senate to be the general counsel of the Revenue Bureau in the Treasury Department, the chief tax enforcement lawyer officer in the country. And it was a big and complex job, and he wasn't a tax specialist, but he was now supervising a staff of 200 lawyers. As Nuremberg, among other things, later showed, Jackson didn't have much interest in administration and wasn't exactly great at it. He actually loved tangible, hands-on personal projects like cases. Luckily for him at Revenue, he had a strong deputy, so he shunted the administrative work off to that fellow. And he started to do some big cases. Big tax cases in 1934 by the end of the year and into 1935. One of them, most famously, is the Andrew Mellon civil tax case in Pittsburgh. Another one involved a fellow whose name might not be familiar. Anyone know the name Ivar Kruger? He was the Match King, and he was dead by 1935. He'd committed suicide because he had been exposed as the great fraudster of his era, an international criminal he sort of made Ponzi look like a piker. His empire was an enormous financial pyramid made of nothing. And as he'd been exposed and as the authorities were closing in, he ended his own life. And then his estate filed a tax refund claim with the United States government. You see, their argument was, we paid taxes when there was no income. So give us back our tax payments. You were not legally entitled to them. And these were enormous tax payments on the allegedly enormous Match King fortune of Mr. Kruger. So Robert Jackson, you may not realize this, a notable Swede, well, at least he was from Jamestown and knew a lot of notable Swedes, took the point in handling the Kruger Match King restitution of the tax payments investigation. And it required a trip to Sweden. Now, the word junket maybe should occur to us because a lot of the legwork could have been done by others. But Robert Jackson and his wife Irene booked passage on a transatlantic ocean liner. Doug, they existed in 1935. And they crossed the ocean, leaving their 2 young children, their son William and Mary, the mother of Tom and Julia, here in Jamestown in the care of neighbors. And they were gone for a long time. And they went to Stockholm, and Jackson did a lot of work with Treasury team, tracking down European assets and corporate records, etc. And then, after the work was done, they did a bit of traveling in Europe. And one of the places they went in the fall of 1935 was Germany. They did not get to Nuremberg, so I didn't say Jackson's going to Nuremberg in this first phase, but they went to Berlin. They stayed in the Adlon, they walked unter den Linden, they saw brown shirts, they saw swastikas, they spent time in the heart of Nazi Germany. And as Jackson observed later, privately and ruefully, he didn't really notice. I mean, yes, that was the government. Yes, that was the chancellor. Yes, that was the political party. Yes, there were issues. There was turmoil. The concentration camps, which were confinements of political enemies without due process, had all commenced a year or more earlier. But focusing on it and thinking about it as legally troubling, human rights problematic, personally relevant, sort of sailed past. Jackson and his wife were an American senior attorney and his wife on a working and vacation trip traveling around Europe. Second part of this first segment of Jackson's in Germany is their son, William. I'm now jumping just a few years later. I'm in August of 1939, William Jackson is a college student. So they actually weren't toddlers when they were left behind on the Kruger trip. And William Jackson spent the summer of 1939 in the midst of his time at Yale College on a European junket with a friend. His dad was prosperous enough. Bill had saved some money. He'd worked hard. He put together this bicycling across Europe trip, and it was France and Germany. And they're bicycling across Germany in late August of 1939. That is not a casual time to be bicycling around Europe. And the letters and the parental concern and some of the wires are, of course, getting more and more pronounced. Bob and Irene, home in Washington as their base and here in Chautauqua County as summer visitors, were noticing from a distance, Germany and what was boiling and about to boil over. Bill and his friend, oblivious bicyclists. Brilliant young men, but just having a good time with backpacks and staying in chambres and rooming houses and drinking wine and beer and having fun. And finally capitulating and accepting the parental order to get your tail on a boat and come back early. And so they leave before the end of August. Now, being in Germany on September 1st probably wouldn't have been particularly dangerous. Being in Poland on September 1st was, of course, catastrophic. The not noticing, Jackson Robert in 1935, Jackson William in 1939, is now to be juxtaposed with my second topic, which is getting back to Germany. Jackson's going back to Germany, because of course they both did. Justice Jackson famously as the chief prosecutor, and Bill, by then a Harvard Law School graduate, a 26-year-old lawyer, as his father's executive assistant. And I'll add a little revealing touch of Robert Jackson here. Bill was very concerned as the Jackson staff was being announced that it would look like nepotism, to have your son as your executive assistant. And, Frank Shea, the former dean of the UB Law School, and Sidney Alderman, the general counsel of the Southern Railway, while Bill Donovan, the head of the OSS. This is the Jackson team, and then his son. And so he kind of almost tried to back out and told his father, this is not good. And his father said, whose son am I supposed to hire? Which shows you a bit of the Jacksonian confidence. And Bill Jackson was a brilliant young lawyer. Now, how did they get back? Bill gets back as his father's son. So let me focus on Bob Jackson and how he got back to Germany. First, he got back as a function of a life of work and rising based on his talents. He had enormous ambitions. There is no minimizing that. And he worked hard to sort of shine and rise in each forum in which he spent a part of his life. Probably in the woods around Spring Creek, to be the best hiker and hunter and fisherman and navigator and whatever. And he was a young boy. Definitely in Frewsburg as a schoolboy. Definitely at the Jamestown High School as a postgraduate 17 and 18-year-old. Definitely as a law apprentice here in Jamestown. Definitely at the Albany Law School for a year. Definitely back in Jamestown as a law apprentice trying to get to age 21 and finally be eligible to take the New York bar. And then as a Jamestown lawyer, first working for scruffy clients who couldn't really pay him, and then capturing notice of industrialists and business people and so forth, and building a Jamestown practice, then getting plucked to Buffalo to work for a big firm because a Buffalo judge had noticed him, then returning to Jamestown to really become a big lawyer here, and from this place to the state stage, the New York Court of Appeals, the national stage, the head of the American Bar Association House of Delegates, and in parallel with that law practice rise, a rise through democratic politics to support an old acquaintance who was back and now running for governor, and then was Governor Roosevelt, and then was running for president, and then was President Roosevelt, and then Washington. And the path in Washington, the rise through the life of work and the application of his talents, was a meteor. From that revenue job in 1934 into 1935, the SEC in 1935, the Justice Department in 1936, Tax Division, Antitrust Division, 1938, he's Solicitor General. He argues 40 cases before the Supreme Court in the next 2 years, brilliantly. 1940, Attorney General of the United States. Summer of 1941, Associate Justice of the United States. And here now, a line that I find deeply personally depressing. He's only 49 years old. Talent plus ambition, achievement, and a thread that runs through all of that, deep engagement with things that mattered. He noticed things, opportunities, challenges, fights, causes, people. And for whatever blind spots he, like any of us, had, generally, he didn't waste time. He lived a life of substance. And he lived in a time without our distractions, so, he wasn't, on a device walking around streets like this. He was thinking or talking or looking. He wasn't watching TV. He was barely listening to radio. His life, his mind, his time, his work, his efforts, his engagement were all of one piece. And then he's on the Supreme Court in 1941, and the World War starts. He's appointed in July. Pearl Harbor happens in December. That's a backwater to be a Supreme Court justice. And during the war years, he was kind of itchy there. He offered to resign and come back into the executive branch. Roosevelt said, "This is a time for warriors, and you're no warrior. You are a lawman. I want to make you Chief Justice. You're building a reputation as a justice on the court. Stay there. Although after the war, there may be tasks that you are uniquely suited to perform." Now, Roosevelt isn't there by mid-April of 1945, but Harry Truman is. And Harry Truman, who knew Bob Jackson, who felt that Bob Jackson had really made his Truman Senate Committee a success by providing Department of Justice assistance, calls because he needs America's best lawyer for a very big project, to represent the country, to deliver on the commitment, to prosecute the Nazi aggressors who had breached the peace as international criminals. And Jackson patriotically responds to the call. Of course, it also appeals to his ambition and his talents, and it is a big challenge. And then he defines what it must be for someone like him to perform it. You see the incredible sting of injury, the feel of vengeance, the desire for summary retribution was, of course, as has been described, the prevalent, completely human, understandable emotion. And we, the Allies, and particularly the United States, with captured Nazis, had the power to do that, and pretty much as we wished. Line them up, and line up more, and line up more, and line up more. That could have been the approach to the perpetrators. Jackson said, privately to Truman and publicly in a report to the people, the executive may handle this as it wishes. But if the executive, meaning the president, meaning the power of the nation, wants a law proceeding, I am a person prepared to do it. I'm prepared to bring due process to the accountability for the Nazis who we believe are the perpetrators. What does that mean? It means evidence. We will show guilt of individuals. Evidence of what? Crimes, violations of norms, if not previously enforced, at least pre-existing in moral and universal and national and treaty systems. It means doing this fairly, which means not with a power disparity. Defense counsel of choice, even if these defendants want big-time Nazi lawyers. Okay. Well, these guys are in penury. They're, war prisoners. They can't afford that. We will pay for that. What can they use to make their case? We will give them evidence, liberal discovery, compulsory process, location of witnesses. How will we show that we're doing this? We will do it in public as a trial in an open courtroom with press corps sitting and reporting on a daily basis. And who will decide if we have done this? Not ourselves, not the prosecutors. We won't run the judgment process. It will be an independent judiciary that does not work for us. That's the law path, and Jackson articulates that on the front end. Then he has to do a very hard diplomatic process to get the Russians to agree, but eventually they do. And an agreement is reached by late summer of 1945 to create this International Military Tribunal. Nuremberg is selected as the site. The charges are brought against individuals. The indictment is filed. The discovery is provided. The defense attorneys are located and transferred to Nuremberg and allowed to work with their clients. And all of this is done by November of 1945. And the trial starts on November 20th. Notice what has aligned to make possible this talented person and this vision of law happen in the Nuremberg courtroom. It is an allied decision to use power in that rational pursuit. Jackson's opening statement at Nuremberg is a grand document, a beautiful essay, a much quotable speech. In all of it, my favorite phrase is three small words: power pays reason. That we did it this way, he said, is the greatest tribute that power has ever paid to reason. Which means, instead of vengeance, instead of emotion, instead of force, self-restraint, reflection, decision, design, and a law path. 1945 was a special moment. When you have a world war and one side loses and surrenders unconditionally, the other side, all the power, is the rest of the world. And they decide to do it this way under the leadership of Robert Jackson. Now, the next segment, let me tell you briefly about the trial. And I want to focus on just three dimensions. You know much about Nuremberg, and you can study much about Nuremberg, and there is much that one should study and learn about Nuremberg. But first, Nuremberg was a matter, as I said, of proof, of evidence. And to the consternation of the press corps, which wanted more courtroom fireworks, it turned out to be a case that was provable largely on captured documents. Authentic, unimpeachable, defendant signed, defendant received, defendant read, defendant acknowledged documents. And that showed that these surviving leaders of the sectors of Nazi perpetration were the decision makers, were the approvers, were the actors, were the responsible individuals. And of course, that record was part of carrying the burden of proof beyond a reasonable doubt in that courtroom. But that record is the published and internet available and library filling documentary record of the Nuremberg trials. And that means it's not just about 1945, 1946. That means it becomes history's knowledge. And on the basis of that bedrock, scholarship, learning, teaching, analysis, comprehension is part of what we've achieved over the last 70 years. They got a big start on it in Jackson's time, in Jackson's trial, but we build on that. They didn't use the word Holocaust. They're wrapping their minds around the enormity of what they're discovering and proving. Jackson goes from hearing 5.7 million exterminated in June 1945, the first number he hears, and thinking that's implausible, it's incredible, and having documents that allow that to be charged in October and then proven to the satisfaction of the tribunal a year later when it occurs, when the judgment occurs. That evidence makes Holocaust knowledge part of our reality, Holocaust teaching an important part of our responsibility, and Holocaust denial a regrettable but fringe activity of crackpots. Why? Because the evidence disproves their claims and their beliefs. A second dimension of the trial is the fundamental fairness, not perfection, but fundamental fairness of doing it that due process way rather than that power way that was the Jackson choice. It did all occur in public. It did all occur on the record. It did all get audio recorded. It did, unfortunately, not much get filmed, but in spots got filmed. And that record allowed assessment in its time and ever since, which finds things to criticize or at least comment on. But over the 70-year period, I think it's fair to say criticism has dwindled. And appreciation and perspective has become admiration for what they did in Nuremberg as a matter of fairness. How fair was it? Think of three men, their pictures are here, who hear the tribunal on September 30, 1946, declare that they're not guilty. The other defendants, the 18 others, are found guilty. And they're each marched back into the prison through the door in the back of the defendant's box, down the elevator, into the passageway, back to the adjoining prison. And these three, Hans Fritzsche, Hjalmar Schacht, and Franz von Papen, are sitting there in the defendant's box, kind of looking around at each other. You know, what are we supposed to do now? And an American MP says, I don't give a damn what you do now. You were just acquitted, so you're no longer my problem. They briefly walk out of that courthouse free men. They then see masked Germans ready to string them up, and they kind of come in and ask for protection. But they're acquitted. There's no more powerful proof of the fairness of Nuremberg than that it didn't summarily or conclusively or unanimously convict and execute every defendant in the box. Now, for Robert Jackson in the moment as a prosecutor who thought he'd carried his burden of proof, at least two of those acquittals stung, Schacht and von Papen. But with a little bit of reflection, and you see this across Jackson's speeches and writings about Nuremberg for the rest of his life, he was almost more proud of his acquittals, the work he'd done and lost in the eyes of the tribunal, than his victories, his convictions won at Nuremberg. A third dimension, and Tanya Beyer has pointed to this, and it is particularly striking to hear a German voice point to this. The Nuremberg trial pinned it on culpable individuals. It wasn't a prosecution of a nation, although people and political support is a context that's very important to understand and think about. Nuremberg didn't avoid that. But Nuremberg didn't subject the German people and the German land to a slavery, a pastoral, peasant, agrarian existence, a pariah nation confinement for the future. It identified in the first trial 24 individuals plus 6 organizations, and then in the subsequent trials about 200 more individuals who, yes, were very high in the pyramid, leaving many more layers of individuals not addressed except through denazification processes that got softer and less effective as time passed. But individual and most accountable individual decision-making is the most fair way to proceed. The worst of the worst is what we would call it, and that's what Nuremberg focused on. What it did, of course, was accomplish justice as to them, and the flip side of it is that it allowed the German people their future. Germany today, where a number of us just were, where I have the good fortune to go regularly and work with dear colleagues who share and are committed to this Nuremberg legacy, is, a dazzling land, not just, sort of wealth and food and beer and culture, but liberty, but freedom, but historical commitment, but a legacy of human rights as part of what defines Germany. And what is that Germany? That's the Germany that grew out of these horrible ashes of World War II, and over, a short number of years becomes the Federal Republic, and then decades later becomes the unified nation, and today leads the world in ways that are just more heartening than I have the words for. Robert Jackson and Bill Jackson and Father Fuchs and everybody else who was a part of Nuremberg in 1945, 1946 couldn't have imagined today's Germany. But in a sense, they deserve a lot of credit. And at a personal level, it's been a great thrill to be in Nuremberg with Father Fuchs on a number of occasions to sort of see him see and experience that. So what are the legacies of the Nuremberg trial? Well, first, exactly that story, exactly that history, and in much more detail than I have a chance to share with you tonight. This is something that we share and we can teach and we can learn from and we can be heartened by and we can be elevated by in international and grand arenas, if those are the places where we do our work, but frankly, in any local, parochial, individual, small arena where we do our work. This is a success story, and studying success stories increases the odds of one's success. Second, Germany. Germany, Germany, Germany. Think about it, learn about it, look at what its position is about, for example, refugees in the last 2 years, look at its politics, look at its dealing with extreme and fringe elements, and look at its economic and liberty and political and law systems. That's a part of the Nuremberg legacy. More broadly than Nuremberg, more broadly than Germany as a geopolitical reality, look at the legal legacies of Nuremberg. There are questions, as Tanya referred to, about whether Nuremberg is retroactive justice or not. And Robert Jackson had answers that fully satisfied him and fully satisfied the tribunal in answering that charge. But his fallback position was a quintessentially kind of pragmatic Jackson observation. He said, and after all those answers, if I'm wrong and it's illegitimate to do it now, at least for the future, we will have done it now, and so they will have the precedent of Nuremberg. In other words, post-Nuremberg, for the future, there won't be a question of whether aggressive war-making is a crime, whether war crimes are crimes, whether crimes against humanity and genocide are crimes. We are at least establishing that here, if nobody has established it first. And those have become embodied in our international law, in the Geneva Conventions, in the Genocide Convention, in the modern international tribunals, in treaty commitments that great states around the world in overwhelming numbers have committed to. And the delivery on all of those legal developments happen internally to nations. That's a part of Nuremberg. The rights cultures in nations and human rights as a global culture is part of the legacy of Nuremberg. And the enforcement mechanisms are a legacy of Nuremberg. They don't quite have the great alignment of consensus, the world unanimity that 1945 had. But in spots we've touched that. Yugoslavia was a moment. Rwanda was a moment. For some of the world, the creation of the International Criminal Court was such a moment. And the future might present us with horrors that many or most or all of the world looks at and says, that's one too. And then we have a template. We have a blueprint. We have an ideal to follow, which is to do our Nuremberg in the case of a tyrant, in the case of atrocities, in the case of naked aggression that the world disapproves of and chooses to use its power to deal with through a law process. Another legacy, and this brings us home to this room and this center, is education. Teaching this to oneself and to one's peers, friends, students is an important part of the Nuremberg legacy that we have, that brings us here, that makes you Jackson Center supporters, and that becomes our responsibility going forward. Nuremberg is a big topic with many complex dimensions, but it's something that thus has accessible parts and can be broken down and used to connect with minds from young to very senior, and can be relevant to one's personal context. And that, in my view, is what the Robert Jackson Center does. It helps minds lift. It teaches. It brings itself forward. I want to put in here, in a very small and not too Ed McMahonish way, a thank you and a request. The thank you is for your generous support. The 15-year mark that we're at is because you have bought in that very tangible way. I've got my latest check here, and I keep writing them, and I will keep writing them to the Jackson Center. You need to do that too. You've done it a lot, and you need to do it much more, because the opportunities we have to reach minds and lift them is almost unlimited. It's just a question of the resources that you commit to. So I want to conclude by pointing you to two Jackson moments. One is one of the last things he wrote. In the spring of 1954, he wrote a preface to a book that Whitney Harris, of his staff at Nuremberg, a young prosecutor of Ernst Kaltenbrunner, later a law professor in Dallas at SMU, had written, called Tyranny on Trial. It's a great narrative account of the Nuremberg evidence. What did the documents show? What did the Nazis do? What was the Third Reich? And in that preface, that introduction to Harris's book, just months before Jackson's death, he writes that the months spent at Nuremberg, the hard months working on these hard topics in those hard conditions, were by far the most important work of his life. That's a principle that sort of separates, I think, this opportunity. This declined to let him resign, so it was a court of 8. Side comment, 8 is not a great number for the Supreme Court. And he was bound and determined to be back on the bench by the first Monday of October, 1946. He wasn't going to miss the start of the next year, if you will. And the judges at Nuremberg were writing their judgment, and it was slipping from early September to September 15th. All of a sudden, it was late September. Jackson's thinking, can I go back and make it back? And he does, and he's there September 30, October 1st. Immediately gets on a plane, leaves Europe, never returned, flies back to Washington, and sort of switches briefcases, and then keeps a date that he had long committed to. You see, he was from Western New York. And Western New York is a lot of things, but in his heart, Jamestown, and in his heart, the people, and the region, and learning and education. His particular commitment was to the University of Buffalo, which was celebrating its centennial. And across its first 100 years, it awarded 0 honorary degrees. It was not something that UB did. But in that centennial year, they decided they would start. They would give one to Robert Jackson. And then they put together a roster to round it out, and they gave, all told, about 7 or 8 honorary degrees. Vannevar Bush and a number of others were recipients. But Jackson was the one speaker at that centennial, long scheduled for Friday, October 4, 1946. So Nuremberg judgment, September 30, October 1. Back in Washington, October 2. A day in the office, October 3, up to Buffalo, October 4th. And he gives a speech in Kleinhans Music Hall on the occasion of the centennial. And it's about Nuremberg. And it's a public explanation of what he's just been part of doing and how this has concluded and what the judgment of the tribunal says, and then how it connects to where he is and looking forward to the future. And he says the point is education. Yes, he's at a university. Yes, it's celebrating its centennial. But the point of Nuremberg is to learn from the evil and to learn from accountability and to inoculate the future so as to improve our chances of not doing that. He says with a shudder that one horrifying dimension of Nuremberg was how highly educated the perpetrators on average were. There are a few exceptions. He said this is what educated people should learn about so as not to somehow fail to think about core things. In other words, notice, he's saying. He doesn't quite say, as I failed to do 11 years earlier when I walked in Berlin and didn't notice the SS and the brown shirts and the swastikas. But he's saying to University of Buffalo and its audience and its students and higher education, notice, study, teach, educate. Because that's our best chance. And that's what the Jackson Center does. That's what I have the privilege to do. That's what I have the privilege to benefit from as a learner. And I'm delighted to be in it with each of you together for a long time going forward, with the lights on. Thank you very much. Since we have the privilege to have an international dimension here, I asked Tanya Beyer if she would just say a closing word, and then Sue Murphy will finish up the program. So, Tanya, I just want to shake your hand so the podium is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Greg, for this, really wonderful lecture. Of course, when you grow up in Germany and go to school in Germany, of course you hear of the Third Reich, you learn about the Nazi regime, you learn about the Holocaust, you learn about the atrocities that the Nazis did in the countries they invaded. Of course, you hear about the Nuremberg Trial as well. Well, my school years are long gone, and I had forgotten, especially, the details of the Nuremberg Trial. They don't really teach in German school, because, there are so many dimensions to that. Or maybe I've just forgotten it, because it's been a couple of years now that I left school. But so when preparing for tonight and when drafting the speech, I remembered many things, and I learned so much more than I had ever learned in school or at university, training as a lawyer. If you don't specialize in international law, you don't really think a lot about the Nuremberg Trial. But of course, when I went to diplomatic school, there is this international law, international law dimension to it as well. So you do think about international law, war crimes, international criminal law. But really, I watched a couple of documentaries preparing for tonight. I read a number of articles. But really, I learned so many details from also reading the newsletters you have been sending out to me since I confirmed my participation tonight. And I've learned so much more in the past couple of weeks and also tonight than I did in all my school years that, thank you very much for inviting me tonight and for giving me this opportunity to learn more about the whole process. One thing I would like to draw your attention to, because as I was, being driven here today, I was reading the German weekly political magazine called Der Spiegel, the Mirror, which had an issue on the Nuremberg trial just a couple of weeks ago on the 70th anniversary of the primary judgments. And as I walked in here into this room, I immediately recognized two of the photographs that I first saw in that newspaper article today, or news magazine article today. One is, you might see there's one photograph there. It's the second one from the exit with all the paper cluttered about the floor. And that's actually the secretaries preparing the press statement on the judgment being handed out on 1st of October. So I immediately recognized that. It's really interesting. I mean, the whole floor is cluttered with the papers, and there are these secretaries getting the papers in order to hand them out to the press. And the second photograph that I recognized from that Spiegel article is the one here, where you see the military police officers standing in front of the cell doors. Those are the cell doors of the, I guess most of you have been here before, so I'm not telling you anything new, but I found it very interesting because they were assigned the job of looking into the cells every minute to prevent the war criminals from committing suicide. And actually, they did quite a good job, a part in the case of Hermann Göring, who just after the his death penalty had been handed out, went back into his cell, and there was one little corner that could not be seen from those peepholes in the doors, and that was, to protect the accused privacy, was a little corner where the toilet was based. And actually, that was where Hermann Göring managed to swallow a little capsule with Zion Carli, and that way committed suicide before being hanged together with his co-perpetrator. So that is very interesting, to recognize these two pictures that I first saw in the German political magazine, the Spiegel, today on the car. So, thank you very much for introducing me to the work of the Jackson Center. I had heard of it before, but I had never visited, and I'm really glad to have had the chance to do so here tonight and to learn so much more about Robert Jackson's work and about the Robert H. Jackson Center's work. So thank you very much, and please continue in this spirit. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John, and thank you, Tanya, for those words. Before we leave this evening, I would like to remind everyone to visit our website for information on all of our programmings, but particularly the ones that are coming up in the future. And in the near future, we have several. A new exhibit is being prepared by our Archives and Exhibits Manager that we will have an opening of in early December called Keep the Balance. We will also have a Robert H. Jackson Center read-in associated with Giving Tuesday, which I think many of us are becoming more and more familiar with, and then also a Robert H. Jackson Center Family Skate fundraiser. So all coming up in November and December, but you can find all sorts of information about the center on our website. While you're on the website, you can also make your gift online. Just want to remind you one more time. And then click the link to go to our Facebook page and like and share our page with all of your friends. So thank you all. Enjoy the rest of your evening and travel safely home this evening.